The last couple of days, we've had a little bit of a trip down memory lane in some fashion for Marielle and I. On Friday, we went down to Thousand Oaks to Ascension Lutheran Church, which is one of our bigger congregations in California, to celebrate the ordination of a dear longtime friend of ours, a classmate of ours, a roommate from our Cal Lutheran years who we worked at camp with and have kept in close touch over the years. And it was a big celebration. And so whenever we go down to Thousand Oaks, we always have to wander around the campus at Cal Lutheran a little bit, see what's new, see what's there. The chapel is never locked, so we wandered in there. We were one of the first weddings in the chapel at Cal Lutheran when it was constructed, and super fun to see the artwork up front, the cross, the figure on the wall, the altar was done by Ernst Schwitter, an artist on faculty at Pacific Lutheran University, and if that name rings a bell to you, he did a lot of churches, and so it's kind of fun to see these connections as we go places. But it reminds me, particularly in the ordination as well, something that I've experienced. These are steps in a journey. And in the gospel text for today, we hear a story that I'll kind of use what I would argue is a right word, but maybe doesn't feel like the right word at first. And that word is adventure. Sometimes adventures are fabulous and fun and exciting, and sometimes adventures are not that, right? They can be difficult and dark and painful. And many times in our lives, we see different chapters and different adventures that have different components to them. Sometimes we can plan for adventures. Other times, there's not a lot of planning. The adventure is thrust upon us. When we got married, that was a new adventure, and we moved to Ohio, had White Castle once, and then moved on to next steps in the process. Were drafted in the assignment process to a really cold but awesome part of the United States to begin serving. But one of the things that was part of that adventure was the arrival of our first child, Eli. And you know, these kind of adventures, there's a certain amount of things that you can read, which, to be fair, Marielle did a lot more reading on this subject than I did. But what to expect when you're expecting, there are all kinds of things to read through this. We were very excited about this whole new chapter, new state, new church, new job, new child, all of this happening. And Marielle was reading an article in preparation for the birth of Eli that was entitled, How to Find Dr. Right. And it was an article about how to find a pediatrician. So once your child is born, how to sort through the priorities of what's important in finding this doctor. Well, now, Eli showed up at the expected time on some level, but had an opportunity to fly down to Minneapolis ahead of us as he was wrestling with his congenital heart defects at the time. And it was all of a sudden an adventure that we thought would go one way, had suddenly taken a very hard, sharp turn right out of the gate. And we ended up heading down to Minneapolis to meet our child who was already there ahead of us, which felt strange. The book seemed to suggest the child goes with you, but nonetheless, there he was. We were sitting in a room waiting to meet his cardiologist, and he walked in and said, "Hi, I'm Dr. Greg Wright." I said, "Of course you are." Of course you are. A man who told us later, as we were getting ready to move back to California, that he had in his whole practice 4 birthdays memorized from his patients, and Eli's was one of those, which gives you a sense of the frequent flyers we were at Minneapolis Children's Hospital. But adventures are fun, but can sometimes be scary and can be challenging, and sometimes we have times to prepare for them, and sometimes that even helps. But not all the time either, right? But the book said it would be like this. Sometimes we don't plan. Sometimes we don't get a chance to plan. In the gospel text that we have today, we have a very dark story. The Greeks come to Jesus speak to his disciples and say, "Sir, we would like to see Jesus." I had a professor in seminary who said that at his internship site, those words were printed in the pulpit so that when a pastor arrived to preach the sermon, in the days when it would be, "Sir, sir, we would like to see Jesus." Now, the story that follows is not the ones that the disciples would want. The disciples have been having quite the adventure. They would go places, Jesus would heal people, he would feed people, he would be a hero. Everybody loved it, and to be close to Jesus, there was a lot of all kinds of good stuff that was happening. But suddenly Jesus starts talking about the way in which he's going to die. They've begun to approach Jerusalem. As we know, we're, 2 Sundays out from Easter here and the adventures of Holy Week, recognizing that not all the adventures are ones that we would choose. Remember those great books? Choose your own adventure. Most of the time, the adventures are not ones that we choose. They're ones that are provided for us in this life. Jesus is discussing how he's going to die, and his disciples don't like the language, the sense that we should be following God, and this shouldn't have to require this kind of path. If we do the right things, we skip the hard adventures, right? In the Old Testament text, we have this sense that God is going to be in relationship with God's people in a different way. No longer shall you teach one another. I've got this great book for you. After you've read volumes 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, let's talk more. But instead, it will be written on their hearts, right? There is a profound sense that as we gather as people of faith in this community together, it is a journey in this life with adventures along the way, importantly, that is not done alone. When we gather and hear the words of the gospel, we recognize that we hear the story of Christ. We hear the adventures of Jesus, the ones that are fun and the ones that are not fun, the ones that are dark and hard, the adventures that go through death to life, all of the adventures. Now, we can approach Holy Week with the idea that these adventures that Jesus had are a great story for us to remember. But I'd say it's a little step further. I know in the adult forum today, the discussion was on the sacraments. And when we enter the church by way of baptism, that water binds us to the story of Christ. A story that is in mission for the world, that we might serve others who are hurting, that we might live in community such that the adventures of this life are something that we celebrate together and that we hold up one another when they're ones that aren't the kind that we celebrate. But most importantly, that in the story and water of baptism, we are tied to Christ in a way that reminds us that through death to new life, Christ's story is in fact our story. As you approach Easter and we begin to hear about these adventures of Jesus that are so familiar to us, that are hard stories to tell, to understand, to wrap our heads around, be mindful, I would say in particular, that these stories and adventures are not just those of Christ. They are our story as well. Amen.